Alright, guys, let's do an update as we approach day X, the end of the global economy as we all know it. So, Europe is now in their worst crisis with Trump back in the office. I'm sure they all didn't expect this one. And there's a very big reason why the EU doesn't want him back. Remember what Trump said during the Davos summit? He's an anti globalist. He doesn't really want global free trade. He wants to put the United States first. And this is actually fine. Trump isn't going about it a smart way. I highly disagree with many of his policies and strategy, but for the EU, this is bad news. Given the setup of how the EU followed the US into the frying pan with Biden, and let's do a quick flashback here. We have the Russian gas cutoff, and of course the Nord Stream blast. We can't forget about that one. So a lot of cheap Russian gas flowing from Siberia all the way into the terminals of Germany, they have been cut off, as well as confiscating Russian sanctions. I mean Russian assets. And when you confiscate Russian assets, this really throws into question the entire integrity of the EU financial system. Let's not forget that 100 billion or less than that is seated in the US. Over 200 billion is in Euroclear sitting somewhere in Belgium. And if this happens, which has been confiscated and seized, a lot of countries, especially in BRICS, especially in the global south, they'll be very hesitant with putting their assets into into instruments like EU bonds and even EU stocks. What does that do? It actually increases the borrowing cost for them. And the EU at this point of time, they can't really afford any hiccup in their economy, and part of it is the financial system as well. And realize that a lot of the EU tariffs on China over the past 12 months is also politically motivated to push them closer to the US. So whatever the EU has been doing over the last 2 years, sure, they got closer to the US, but they also jumped into the frying pan of high inflation and unending deindustrialization. And now Trump, he's taking this frying pan and he's going to flip them all into the fire. Now, Trump came out firing guns blazing and is asking everything from the EU, which will push them closer towards economic collapse. Now, big one is asking for higher defense spending for NATO around 5% of GDP. 5% of GDP. I mean, most of the EU countries, they can't even hit 3 or 4%. In fact, many are not even hitting 2%. None of the EU countries can ever match that without either getting into crippling debt or collapsing their high welfare state economies. Remember, taxes in the EU, in many EU countries, are above 30, 40, or 50%. What are you going to do? Raise it to 60%, 70% to contribute to NATO? I find this highly unlikely. If we look at the ECB, they are really actively cutting rates even when rates in the US are stubbornly high. What does that mean? It shows that their economies are in a very fragile state. They need bond yields to go down. Borrowing money for defense is something that the EU simply can't afford. Now, meanwhile, Trump, he's also pushing the EU to buy more expensive LNG. The US today, they are now facing a new Canada, a Canada that's looking to diversify supply, which will eventually compete with the US. And who is America's biggest gas customer? The customer that buys a lot of LNG with enormous margins. That's going to be the EU, Europe. If Canada is going to go after that customer, the US is definitely right to be freaking out. Now, there's a lot of pressure from big gas giants like Total to get the EU to buy US LNG, but that will just destroy their industries further. Energy prices in the Eurozone are already 3 to 4 times more. It's just impossible to compete at this point. Now, if you think that was bad enough, the EU is not about really about to join China, but they are about to rediscuss their relationship, their economic relationship with China. And in a weird way, Trump is actually pushing the EU towards China, the same way Russia was pushed to China as well. Now, the last straw came when the US decided to tariff metals. This is the ultimate slap to the face of EU steel producers. Now, the only benefit the EU has left with the US is selling to a tariffed market that keeps China out. We need to understand this. But Trump today, he doesn't care. He wants to keep everyone out to revive domestic US industry. It's so incredibly damaging that even EU chief von der Leyen is speaking out against the US. Trump's steel tariffs are going to clobber big industrial economies like Germany, even France, and they export 500,000 tons of steel to the US. It's a very significant amount. Olaf Scholz himself also wants to mobilize the EU consumer market, which is around 450 million strong. This is actually quite a decent bargaining chip because the US, at the end of the day, they also need an export market to sell to. They need a captive customer. Now, 17% of total US exports goes into the EU. And the previous tariffs, the counter tariffs the EU imposed, targeted only around $5 billion worth of US goods. The US can't compete with China overseas, in Asia, or even Latin America because at the end of the day, it all boils down to prices. If you have two products of similar quality, the one that gives you a significant discount is going to win, and that is Chinese products. China exports deflation. So they need the EU as much as the EU needs the US in trade. And why does the EU want to venture closer and move closer to China's economy? It's because Beijing is more resilient than ever. The US today is facing death by a thousand cuts, and the biggest shock is how the EU might be forced to work closer with China, as we said before. Now, China has an attitude, they're adopting an attitude of we are fine with anything. If you come, you come. If you don't come, fine. No sweat off our backs. Because China's economy is now extremely resilient against US tariffs. Now we can see from the charts that China's stock market, which are notoriously reactive, are brushing off Trump's threat. They hardly moved, they even went up. Remember that stocks are forward looking and investors, they are looking towards a brighter future even though China is actively decoupling with the US. China has managed to lower their dependence on the US economy, unlike the G7. US share of imports from China has dropped from 22% to nearly 14%. That's impressive considering China earns a lot of surplus from the US. They are still alive and kicking. Meanwhile, their exports to the world have flown to the moon. Outside of the US, trade is over $250 billion strong. And that's why China is working closer with BRICS members. They're selling more cars to countries like Brazil, for example. Now, the EU sees this and realizes that, hey, we have miscalculated and it's time to work with yet another neighbor of theirs. And since working with Putin is politically impossible, China is going to be their next best choice. Now, what's shocking is von der Leyen is floating the idea of working more with China that she wants to expand EU China trade ties and investments. They want to sell more to the Chinese market, of course, and they want China to invest more into EU industries to set up factories there to pile more money into European companies. Now, this would be horrible for the US because by working with China, the EU can access a powerful ecosystem of manufacturing more robust than the US. And let's not forget China's GDP on a purchasing power parity PPP basis is already higher than the US. And within the next 5, 15, or 20 years at a max, China's absolute GDP is going to beat the US. China, in a sense, to the EU is a proxy of access to cheap Russian energy. China's Xi has also placed big restrictions on the holy grail of Chinese tech, such as EV technology, asking a lot of EV makers to stay at home. But the EU needs it to compete and revive their auto manufacturing industry. Now, it really remains to be seen what von der Leyen can give Beijing. Obviously, removing the EV tariffs is one big concession China will want. Export limits might also work. Now, China's new head of EU affairs is a wolf warrior. Liu She has a hardline personality, so China isn't playing around here. He used to be the ambassador to France, and there were reports that he was summoned at least 7 times to the French consulate, or is it the French government, due to quarrels. So the US is now facing a very sticky situation, a very deep quandary. Biden has set the ball rolling for US losing geopolitical clout in the world, especially the Middle East. We can all remember that fated fist bump with MBS. But Trump's economic war threatens to make things much worse because now allied economies are under threat. You can do a lot of things. You can make jokes. You can say they are the 51st state of the United States, but once you threaten their economy, job losses, GDP collapse, inflation, people eventually in those countries, they're going to get pissed off and they will vote off their politicians if push comes to shove. We can see the damage in French elections, Germany's uncertainty in the polls, and the UK is also a fine example. Why do you think Rishi Sunak left? It's not because the whole situation is rosy. If the EU works with China, they will be essentially united with Asia and Russia. It would be the Eurasia bloc against the US, and a combination of that connected to the Middle East and Africa would most certainly overwhelm the Western Hemisphere in both resources, domestic markets, production, and demand.